Rain doesn't fall in Black Hollow anymore, it hangs in the air like a held breath. The valley sits cupped between ridges so steep the sun only finds it for 3 hours a day, and even then the light looks tired, as if it's already given up on the place. Down the single rutted road, past the rusted mailbox that still reads Hollis though no one has collected mail in 30 years, stands the house. 12 gables. 12 chimneys. 12 windows on each side that never quite reflect the sky the same way twice. People in the county seat still lower their voices when they speak of the Hollis family, the way you do when you're talking about something that might be listening. It began in the winter of 1947, when Elias Hollis carried his young wife Ruth up the porch steps through a snow so fine it looked like ash. She was already showing with their first, and the midwife who followed them refused pay. "Some babies," she muttered, backing toward her Ford, "pay you in other ways." The boy came at dawn. No wail, no gasp, just a soft exhalation, as though the child had been waiting politely for permission to exist. His eyes opened immediately, pale, almost colorless, ringed with a darker gray that made the irises look bottomless. Ruth reached for him and smiled the way a woman smiles when she recognizes someone she's known far longer than this lifetime. One by one they came, 12 in all, each birth quieter than the last. Doctors drove up from Knoxville, then from Atlanta, then from places that don't put their names on maps. They measured, photographed, drew blood that refused to clot under normal light. They left with fewer answers than they brought and, in some cases, never reached the main road again. The children grew tall and straight and silent. They did not run fevers. They did not scar. When the youngest cut her hand on a scythe at age 4, the skin sealed before the blood could fall. Neighbors who peeked through the windows at dusk swore the 12 of them sometimes stood in a perfect circle in the yard, palms pressed together, heads bowed, motionless for hours while the wind moved only around them. And the house kept count. 12 rocking chairs appeared on the porch though Elias swore he never built them. 12 plates at the table though Ruth cooked for far fewer mouths. 12 shadows on the wall at night though only 12 bodies ever walked those floors. People still argue about what the Hollises were. Angels, some whispered. Something that learned to wear children, said others who crossed themselves twice. The truth is simpler and worse. They were a family. They loved one another with a devotion so complete it bent the world a little out of shape around the edges. And on the morning the 12th child drew her first breath, every mirror in Black Hollow cracked from corner to corner at the exact same instant, as though something on the other side had finally decided to look back. Whatever began that day has not ended yet. Out on the ridge, the trees still lean away from the house, the way flowers turn from a colder sun. And if you stand at the edge of the hollow on a night when the moon forgets to rise, you can sometimes hear 12 voices speaking together, soft as snowfall, saying the same 3 words over and over, like a lullaby meant for something that has not yet learned how to sleep. They are waiting. They have always been waiting. January 1947 arrived in Black Hollow like a verdict. The snow that year fell so fine and dry it hissed against the pine needles, erasing footprints almost before they were made. Elias Hollis had been gone 3 days cutting timber on the far ridge when the pain started. Ruth knew the baby was early, but nothing about this pregnancy had followed the ordinary rules. She had never once felt a kick, never a flutter, only a steady pressure low in her belly, as if something inside her were patiently pressing its palms together, waiting for the right moment to push the door open. She lit the kerosene lamp and laid out the same quilts her own mother had used, the ones stitched with tiny crosses meant to keep harm away. Harm, however, had never shown much interest in the hollow. It was other things that lingered here. Ruth's water broke without drama, a slow seep rather than a rush, and the fluid that soaked the sheets looked silver under the lamplight, almost luminous, as though moonlight had decided to arrive early. By the time Elias staggered home, beard rimed with ice, the room was already warm from the cookstove and something else, a heat that seemed to come from the air itself. The midwife, old Cora McAfee, stood in the doorway with her bag clutched to her chest like a shield. She had delivered half the county, but she had never seen a woman labor in perfect silence. Ruth's face was calm, almost dreamy, her lips parted as if she were listening to distant music. No groans, no curses, not even a sharp intake of breath when the next contraction rolled through her. Elias tried to step inside, but Cora blocked him with one thin arm. "Not yet," she whispered, eyes wide. Something in her voice made the hairs rise on his neck. At 5:47 a.m., exactly when the ridge turned the color of a fresh bruise, the child slid into Cora's waiting hands with the softest sound, more sigh than cry. A boy. Long, pale, perfect. His skin carried the faint translucence of river ice. Cora lifted him toward the lamp, and the infant's eyes opened at once. Not the clouded, unfocused blue of most newborns, but a clear, glacial gray ringed with a darker line that made the irises look depthless, like wells no one had ever bothered to fill. Ruth reached out, and the baby turned his head toward her with a deliberate grace no newborn should possess. When their gazes met, the faintest smile touched the corners of her mouth, a private recognition older than either of them. Cora felt the room tilt, just slightly, as if the floorboards had decided to lean in and listen. She wrapped the child in a receiving blanket and laid him in Ruth's arms. Only then did she notice the silence was absolute. No mewling, no snuffling, no reflexive rooting for the breast. Just the soft, steady rhythm of breathing that matched Ruth's own exactly, heartbeat for heartbeat, as though the boy had never truly been separate from her at all. Outside, the snow kept falling, erasing the tracks Elias had made on his way in. Inside, the lamp flame burned taller and steadier than kerosene had any right to allow, painting the walls with a light that felt almost curious. Cora backed toward the door, leaving her payment on the table untouched. She would tell people later that the baby had looked at her, really looked, the way a much older soul studies a locked gate from the inside. And for the rest of her days she would swear that when she crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped so suddenly her breath crystallized midair, while behind her the room stayed warm enough for something new to keep growing. By the time the third child arrived, in the spring of 1951, the county had already begun to treat the Hollis place like a place you point at but never quite look straight on. Dr. Harlan Reed, who had taken over the practice in Copper Ridge after the war, made the drive up the hollow in his black DeSoto because the midwife refused a third time. He told himself it was professional curiosity. He told his wife it was duty. Neither was true. The first two Hollis boys, Jonah and Micah, sat on the porch rail as he pulled up, 4 and 2 years old, barefoot despite the chill, watching him with identical frost-gray eyes that never seemed to blink in sequence. Harlan felt the stare settle on him the way damp wool clings to skin. Ruth met him at the door, belly huge under a faded cotton dress, and smiled the small, private smile that had already become local legend. Labor lasted less than an hour. Harlan had delivered breech babies that took longer. Ruth lay on the same iron bed, gripping the rails only once, and even then her knuckles stayed pale instead of white. When the girl crowned, Harlan expected the usual lusty yell that clears the lungs and announces a soul to the world. Instead there was only the wet sound of arrival and then silence, thick as quilt batting. He lifted the infant clear, slapped the soles of her tiny feet out of reflex more than need. Nothing. No startle, no color change, no cry. The baby opened her eyes immediately and regarded him with the same deliberate calm her brothers had shown from the cradle. Harlan felt his pulse stutter. He turned the child face down across his forearm, rubbed her back the way the textbooks demanded. Still nothing. Not a whimper, not a cough. Ruth reached out. "She's perfect, doctor." He placed the child in her arms and watched, half hypnotized, as the newborn rooted once, latched, and began to nurse with slow, rhythmic pulls that made no greedy newborn gulps, only quiet satisfaction. Harlan pulled out his stethoscope, listened to lungs that sounded impossibly clear, a heart that beat in exact cadence with Ruth's own. He checked the older boys while he was there. Jonah let himself be examined with grave courtesy, Micah copying every breath his brother took. Neither child had ever been sick, Ruth said. Not a sniffle, not a rash, not even colic. Harlan wrote apnea in his notes, then crossed it out. He wrote silent birth, then crossed that out too. On the drive back down the ridge he kept hearing the absence of sound behind him, like a held note that refused to resolve. In 32 years of practice he had never once failed to coax a cry from a newborn, not even the blue ones, not even the ones who never took a second breath. The silence followed him all the way to town. The years began to fold themselves around Black Hollow the way creek mist folds around stones, slow and deliberate, hiding more than it revealed. By 1957 the Hollis children numbered 6, Jonah, Micah, Abigail, Levi, Susanna, and little Eli, born the previous October. The county school bus refused to climb the washed-out road after the driver claimed the children waiting at the gate never cast shadows even at noon. So Ruth taught them at the kitchen table, and what she taught them no one could ever quite discover, because none of the 6 ever spoke of it outside the house. Dr. Harlan Reed still came, though less often now. He told himself it was courtesy, but the truth was closer to compulsion. Each visit he found new reasons to worry and no evidence to support the worry. In 10 years not one of the children had run a fever. Not one. The measles that burned through Copper Ridge in '53 left red tracks on every other child in the valley but never touched the Hollis place. When whooping cough followed 2 winters later, Harlan stood in the yard and listened for the telltale bark that never came. He watched Levi fall from the hayloft in the summer of '56, a 12-foot drop onto packed clay. The boy landed on his left arm with a crack that carried clear to the tree line. Harlan sprinted across the yard expecting compound fracture, bone punching through skin, a scream that would rattle windows. Instead Levi sat up, cradled the arm, and looked at Harlan with mild curiosity, as though waiting to be told what came next. By the time Harlan reached him the swelling had already begun to recede. By supper the arm moved without pain. By morning the skin was unmarked, the bone straight and whole beneath it, as if the fall had been a story someone else told. Harlan started keeping a separate notebook labeled simply Hollis, pages filled with negatives: no fever, no rash, no lymphadenopathy, no scarring, no nocturnal enuresis, no dental caries though the children drank well water and ate sorghum straight from the jar. He wrote regenerative capacity, after the hayloft incident, then drew a line through the question marks until the paper tore. He took to lingering after examinations, hoping for some small ordinary complaint, an earache, a splinter, anything that would let him feel useful. Ruth always offered coffee in the same chipped enamel pot, and the children sat in perfect stillness while he drank it, 6 pairs of frost-grey eyes tracking him with the patience of owls. Once he asked Susanna, then 5, if anything ever hurt. She considered the question the way a carpenter considers a crooked nail, then answered, only when we're away from each other too long. Harlan wrote that down too, and underlined it 3 times. October 1963 came in cold and early. The ridges turned the color of dried blood, and the wind carried the smell of wood smoke and something sharper underneath, like ozone before lightning that never quite arrives. Ruth was 36 now, hair still black as creek water, face unlined in a way that made people look twice and then look away. She carried the 7th child low and heavy, moving through chores with the same unhurried grace she had shown at 19. Labor began after midnight. Elias lit every lamp in the house and sent Jonah, now 16, to fetch Dr. Reed. The boy took the truck and made the trip down the ridge in half the usual time, headlights cutting tunnels through fog thick enough to chew. Harlan arrived with his bag and a thermos of coffee gone cold, boots still wet from the porch at home. Inside, the bedroom felt warmer than the cookstove could account for. Ruth lay propped on pillows, breathing slow and even, eyes fixed on a point somewhere past the ceiling. Harlan checked her pulse, steady, almost leisurely, and realized the contractions were coming strong but silent. No grunt, no gasp, only the faintest tightening across her belly every 90 seconds. At 3:12 a.m. the child crowned. Harlan glanced at the wind-up clock on the dresser, an old Sessions with a loud tick that had kept perfect time for 20 years. The second hand swept past 12, reached 17, and froze. Not slowed, not stuttered, simply stopped, as though time had been pinched shut. In the same instant every light in the house dimmed to a sullen amber, the way a coal oil lamp does when the wick is turned too low. Harlan felt the hairs on his arms rise. The baby slid free at 3:17 exactly, a girl slick with the same silvery fluid he remembered from the first birth. She opened her eyes at once, frost-grey and depthless, and regarded the room with mild interest. Harlan slapped her soles out of habit. No cry. No movement of the chest beyond the shallow rise and fall that matched Ruth's breathing perfectly. He looked up to tell Elias to stoke the stove and saw the man standing motionless by the window, mouth half open, staring at the wall clock whose hands still refused to move. Later, when Harlan drove back to town with the sky already paling behind the ridge, he passed 3 farms in a row and saw the same thing. Mantle clocks stopped, wristwatches dead, the big electric sign at the Esso station frozen between numbers. By the time he reached Copper Ridge, the entire county knew something had happened. At 3:17 a.m. radios still worked, but anything with gears had simply given up. People reset them, wound them, cursed them, and still the hands stayed locked on 317 like a verdict. Harlan parked behind his office, sat in the cold car, and stared at the dashboard clock of the DeSoto, also stopped, naturally. He thought of the newborn girl already nursing calmly at Ruth's breast, of the way the temperature in the room had felt almost expectant, and for the first time in his life he left his medical bag locked in the trunk instead of carrying it inside. The winter of 1966-67 was the first time anyone outside the Hollow heard the children speak with one mouth. It started small. A feed store clerk in Copper Ridge swore that Jonah and Micah, then 19 and 17, walked in together to buy laying mash and asked for it in perfect unison, the same words leaving both throats at the exact same instant, no pause, no overlap, just a single voice wearing two bodies. The clerk dropped the scoop. The brothers paid, lifted the sacks as though they weighed nothing, and left without looking back. By spring the stories had thickened. A Baptist preacher making rounds stopped at the gate to leave tracts and heard Abigail and Susanna, 12 and 10, reciting Psalm 23 from the porch swing. He knew the cadence by heart, but something made him freeze behind the laurel hedge. The girls spoke the entire psalm in one breath, syllables braided so tightly they sounded like one child with an echo built inside her chest. Dr. Reed came again that May, summoned by a note Elias left under a rock at the mailbox. No postage, no explanation, just the single word please. Harlan found all 7 children lined up on the porch steps like birds on a wire, youngest to oldest, barefoot in the warm dust. Ruth stood behind them, hands resting on little Eli's shoulders. She looked tired in a way that went deeper than sleep. Harlan meant to ask about milestones, about language acquisition, but the question died when the children greeted him. 7 mouths opened at once. 7 voices, identical in pitch and timbre, said, "Good morning, Dr. Reed. Mother says you are kind to visit." The sound arrived in his ears as one perfectly formed sentence, layered yet seamless, the way a chord is many notes yet one thing. He felt his knees loosen. Inside, he examined the newest, Naomi, born the night the clock stopped, and confirmed she had begun speaking full sentences at 5 months. Not babble, not imitation, but complete declarative thoughts. "The rain is late this year," she told him while staring at his stethoscope as though it were an interesting beetle. "Father will need to move the south fence before the creek rises." Harlan asked Ruth if they ever spoke separately. She hesitated, the first crack he had ever seen in her calm. "Only when they choose to," she said. "Mostly they prefer not to waste words." That afternoon he watched from the kitchen window as the 7 of them carried water buckets to the garden. They moved in a loose circle, passing the pails hand to hand without looking, speaking among themselves in a low murmur that rose and fell like wind through wheat. When a stranger's truck rattled past on the ridge road, the murmur stopped instantly. All 7 heads turned toward the sound. All 7 mouths said, clear enough to carry across the yard, "He will not come closer today." Harlan left before supper, hands shaking so badly he could barely shift gears. In the rearview mirror he saw them standing at the gate, 7 silhouettes framed by the dying light, motionless, waiting for the dust to settle before they spoke again. The summer of 1970 brought the first outsider who came armed with paperwork instead of curiosity. His name was Leonard Griggs, 31, thin as a fence rail, and newly hired by the Tennessee Department of Health to map childhood vaccination rates in remote districts. He drove a pale green Plymouth Valiant with government plates and carried a Polaroid SX70 that still smelled of factory plastic. He arrived unannounced on a Tuesday when the air hung so thick you could wring it out. Elias was in the upper field, Ruth was hanging wash behind the house. Griggs parked at the gate, stepped over the cattle guard, and began taking pictures the way some men smoke, quick, automatic, half guilty. He photographed the porch with its 12 empty rocking chairs, the smokehouse, the children who watched him from the shade of the elder tree like a jury already decided. 7 of them were home that day. They stood in a loose semicircle, barefoot, sun-bleached hair silver at the tips, eyes the color of winter sky. Griggs asked polite questions about measles shots and whooping cough boosters. The children answered in their braided voice, soft, precise, and somehow always one sentence ahead of what he intended to ask. He wrote nothing down. The notebook felt suddenly childish in his hand. Instead he lifted the camera again. The shutter clicked 12 times in rapid succession. Each time the children tilted their heads a fraction, tracking the lens the way cats track a bird they have already caught in their minds. Griggs told himself the prickling at his nape was only sweat. He thanked them, backed toward the Plymouth, and promised to mail copies of the photographs. The children said nothing, only watched until the car disappeared around the bend. Then they turned as one and walked into the house. Griggs never reached Copper Ridge. His car was found the next morning nose down in a ravine off Laurel Fork Road, doors locked, keys in the ignition, no skid marks, no alcohol on his breath. The Polaroids were still in the camera, film advance half finished. When the sheriff pulled the tab on the first picture, the square bloomed white, then grey, then nothing at all. 12 frames, 12 perfect blanks, as though light itself had refused to be caught looking at them. The Valiant was towed to the county yard. The camera sat on a shelf in the evidence room for years, battery long dead, film pack still inside. Every few months a deputy would pull another tab out of curiosity. Each time the result was the same, an empty rectangle of grey, smooth and featureless as a closed eye. People said Leonard Griggs had simply fallen asleep at the wheel. People said a lot of things. But the children never mentioned him again, and the rocking chairs on the porch kept rocking long after the wind died, slow and patient, waiting for the set to be complete. The winter of 1974-75 was the hardest anyone could remember. Ice glazed the ridges for 6 straight weeks, and the creek froze so thick that Elias could drive the truck across it to reach the woodlot. Ruth was carrying the 10th child, her body swollen and slow in a way that finally looked mortal. The other 9 moved around her like quiet moons, bringing tea she barely sipped, laying fresh kindling she never seemed to feel. One February night the temperature dropped low enough to split trees. Elias was asleep in the rocker by the stove, exhausted from chopping a path to the barn. Ruth woke in the dark with the familiar pressure low in her back, but for the first time the pressure felt wrong, hollow somehow, as if the weight had been there all along and only now decided to remind her it was borrowed. She walked the narrow hallway to the kitchen, trailing one hand along the wall for balance. Moonlight spilled through the window in a single pale blade across the table where Father Daniel Calloway sat waiting. He had come up from Knoxville the previous autumn after hearing rumors in the confessional, whispers from truck drivers, from a deputy who wouldn't meet his eyes. Ruth had refused him twice. Tonight the door had been unlatched. She lowered herself into the opposite chair without surprise. The priest smelled of wet wool and candle smoke. Between them the lamp burned steady, flame neither rising nor falling. "I've never felt it move," she said before he could speak. Her voice was soft, almost conversational, the way you confess the weather. "Not once. Not any of them." Father Daniel's fingers tightened around the rosary in his lap. "The others, did you feel them?" Ruth shook her head. There was pressure. Fullness. Never a kick, never a turn. Just waiting. She placed both palms on the curve of her belly, pressing gently, as though testing the skin of a drum. "This one is quieter than the rest. Sometimes I think it's already gone ahead without me." The priest leaned forward. "Ruth, whatever you're carrying." "It's mine," she cut in, gentle but absolute. "They're all mine. I knew the first time Jonah looked at me. He recognized me the way you recognize home after you've been lost for longer than you can measure." She closed her eyes. In the stillness the house seemed to breathe with her, floorboards expanding and settling in perfect rhythm. Somewhere upstairs 9 children slept without dreaming, their pulses braided together like roots under frost. Father Daniel tried again. "There are rights. Protections." Ruth opened her eyes. The lamplight caught the grey rings around her irises and made them look suddenly depthless. "They chose me," she said. "Long before Elias ever did. I was never asked. Only chosen." She stood, slow and careful, one hand braced on the table. The priest rose too, reaching out, but something in her face stopped him cold. She walked past him to the door and held it open. Wind knifed through the room, lifting the corners of the calendar, but the lamp flame never wavered. "Tell your God," she said quietly, "the debt is almost paid." Father Daniel left without his hat. He never came back up the hollow. But for years afterward he woke before dawn with the taste of iron in his mouth, feeling the weight of something vast and patient pressing against the inside of his ribs, waiting for the last two to be born. The morning of August 12, 1978, broke clear and hot, the kind of heat that makes the air above the fields tremble like water. The 9 children rose before dawn as always, moving through chores in their quiet synchrony, feeding chickens, drawing water, mending fence without a spoken word between them. No one noticed anything unusual until they gathered for breakfast. Ruth was first to see it. She stood at the cook stove, turning cornbread, when Jonah stepped past her to reach for the molasses. His sleeve rode up, and there on the center of his palm was a perfect circle of blistered skin, the size of a $50, raw and red as if it had been pressed to a branding iron. He didn't flinch. He simply looked at the mark the way you look at an unexpected letter, curious rather than hurt. Within minutes the others discovered the same. Every child, from 31-year-old Jonah down to 3-year-old Naomi, carried the identical burn in the exact center of the right palm. The edges were raised and shining, the skin inside blanched white, and at the heart of each circle lay 7 tiny points arranged like a star no one had ever charted. The burns were hot to the touch, yet none of the children registered pain. When Ruth tried to dab salve on little Naomi's hand, the girl closed her fingers gently around her mother's wrist and said, "It isn't finished yet." Elias fetched the magnifying glass from his roll-top desk. Under the lens the marks revealed finer details, concentric rings so precise they might have been drawn with a compass, and in the white center, faint lines that suggested script in a language no one recognized. Dr. Reed was summoned again, though everyone knew by now he would leave with more questions than answers. He arrived at dusk, sweat-stained and grim, and examined each palm under the harsh brightest lamp in the house. The burns were 3rd degree, he said, voice shaking, yet there was no swelling, no infection, no sign the nerves had ever fired. The tissue beneath looked cauterized clean, as though whatever had touched them had done so with a heat too perfect to scar. He sketched the pattern frantically in his notebook, pages already swollen with years of impossibilities. When he asked what had caused it, the 9 children answered together, calm and clear, "We were called." That night they sat in a circle on the living room floor, palms upturned on their knees, the marks glowing faintly in the dark like embers under ash. Ruth watched from the doorway, one hand resting on the curve of her belly where the 11th child waited. The air in the room felt thick, expectant, the way it does before thunder that refuses to break. Outside, every dog in the hollow began to howl at once, a high, thin sound that climbed the ridge and kept climbing long after their throats should have given out. The burns never blistered further. They never scabbed. They simply stayed open and luminous, waiting for the 12th hand to complete the ring. October 1981 arrived with a wind that smelled of iron and coming snow. The 11th child, a boy named Gideon, had come the previous winter, silent and grey-eyed like all the rest, bringing the count to 11. The house felt fuller than its walls should allow, every corner crowded with stillness. That afternoon a battered Ford pickup rattled up the hollow carrying 2 couples from Knoxville, city people in quilted jackets and new boots, come to see the witch children they'd read about in a supermarket tabloid. They parked at the gate, cameras swinging from their necks like medals, laughing too loudly at their own daring. The children were in the yard splitting kindling. 11 of them, ranging from 34-year-old Jonah down to 10-month-old Gideon in a basket lined with lamb's wool. The strangers fanned out, snapping pictures, calling questions that went unanswered. Ruth watched from the porch, arms folded under her shawl, face unreadable. The boldest visitor, a man with a red beard and a Nikon, stepped close to the basket and aimed his lens at Gideon. The baby regarded him with the same calm depth all the children carried. Then the youngest who could speak, 3-year-old Naomi, walked forward, bare feet silent on the frost-stiff grass. She stopped an arm's length from the man and looked up. "You will die on March 9, 2004, she said, voice soft, almost kind. At 14 minutes past 6 in the morning. You will be alone." The man laughed, uneasy, and glanced at his friends for rescue. Naomi turned to the red-haired woman beside him. "You will live until you are 81, she told her. But you will forget your children's names before the end." One by one she moved through the group, touching no one, simply meeting their eyes and speaking a single sentence each. Dates, times, circumstances delivered with the mild certainty of a child reciting lessons learned long before birth. A heart attack in a grocery aisle. A fall down basement stairs. Peaceful sleep that never ended. Each prediction landed like a stone dropped into deep water, the ripples spreading across their faces. The visitors left faster than they came, tires spinning gravel, laughter gone brittle. The man with the red beard was killed 23 years later exactly as described, March 9, 2004, 6:14 a.m., alone in a motel off I-40, coronary event listed as cause of death though the autopsy found no blockage, no warning, only a heart that had simply decided to stop counting. Back in the yard that October afternoon, the children returned to their chores without comment. The wind shifted and carried their quiet voices up the hollow, speaking together in the layered chord that had become their natural tongue. Ruth stood on the porch long after the dust settled, one hand pressed to the small of her back where the 12th child pressed outward, patient and immense, waiting for its turn to speak the world a little thinner. April 17, 1984, broke cold and still, the kind of morning when birds forget to sing. Ruth had been in labor since before moonset, but the house made no sound of it. Elias walked the porch in his stocking feet, hands opening and closing around nothing. The older children sat inside in a perfect circle, palms upturned, the circular burns now pale and seamless, as though the skin had accepted whatever message had been written there. Dr. Harlan Reed arrived at 5:30, older now, hair gone the color of ash, hands trembling from more than age. He had promised himself this would be the last time. He carried no bag, only a flask he never opened. Ruth lay on the same iron bed where it had all begun 37 years earlier. Her face was translucent, veins showing blue beneath the skin like rivers under ice. She smiled when Harlan entered, the same private smile she had given the first child, and he felt the years collapse between them. The contractions came far apart, almost courteous. Between them Ruth's breathing stayed slow, deliberate, as though she were counting something only she could see. At 6:58 the final push began. Harlan knelt, ready to receive whatever came. The girl slid free at 7:03 with no more resistance than a sigh. Smaller than the others, almost fragile, yet her eyes opened at once, frost gray, ringed darker, ancient. Harlan lifted her, wiped her face, waited for the reflex cry that had never come before and did not come now. Instead the infant turned her head toward the circle of her siblings waiting in the hall, and for the first time in 37 years every child in the house drew breath separately, audibly, like 12 instruments finding their own note after a lifetime of playing the same chord. Then it happened. In the dresser mirror, Harlan saw his own reflection blink a fraction after he did. He turned, heart lurching, but the glass behind him showed the room exactly as it was, except the reflection of Ruth on the bed was still smiling while the real Ruth had already closed her eyes in exhaustion. Before he could speak, a sound like ice splitting in deep water traveled through the house. Every mirror cracked at once, the dresser, the hall stand, the small hand mirror on the washstand, even the dark surface of the kettle on the stove fractured into perfect radial webs, as though something on the other side had leaned too hard against the glass. The newborn made no sound, only lifted one tiny hand toward her siblings. 11 palms rose to meet it, the circular marks now glowing faintly, completing the ring. Harlan felt the temperature plummet though the stove still roared. His breath hung white in front of him while the children's did not. Outside, the morning light dimmed for 3 full seconds, the way it does during an eclipse no one predicted. When it returned, the cracks in every mirror had sealed again, leaving no trace except a hair-fine line that caught the light wrong, like a scar across an eye. Harlan stood frozen, the 12th child warm and impossibly heavy in his shaking hands, while 12 pairs of grey eyes turned toward him with the same patient recognition Ruth had shown all those years ago.